All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second Membership Committee Brown Bag web series. The Membership Committee consists of myself. I'm Lacey Hill-Castern, and I'm currently actually serving my last month with as a board member for the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society. And then on our committee, we also have Brian Haringa. He's a wildlife biologist for the U.S. Forest Service. Jenna Malinowski, she's a wildlife biologist for Wisconsin DNR, and Jennifer Summers from the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. The membership committee first got together this fall to discuss what the membership committee should actually be doing. And what we decided is that we wanted to offer something for our members, but also offer something to try to encourage more membership within the society. So that's where these webinars came about. We host them on the second Wednesday of each month, right at lunchtime. And we have presentations. We have presentations by our members, for our members, and these are free for everybody. So feel free to spread the word. If you have any ideas or would like to give a future presentation, please feel free to contact me. I can put my email in the chat. If you're not a member, this month is a great month to join the society. The society will be having a virtual winter meeting from February 22nd through the 25th. And I can also post that registration link in the chat box as soon as I'm done talking. The registration for this event is only $30. And you'll be able to watch 3 days of really good presentations. This is the 50th anniversary for our state chapter. And the theme for the meeting is reflecting on the past and building on an inclusive future. So now to the main event. Today we have Peter David, a wildlife biologist from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and Drew Hawley, a wildlife technician from the Wisconsin DNR. And they're going to be talking to us today about wild rice, biology, restoration, and management. Each speaker will give about a 20-minute presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So to start us off will be Peter David. Peter's work includes assisting GLIFWC member tribes in implementing their off-reservation treaty reserve rights. He received his education, both bachelor's and master's degrees in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the tribal elders and members he has worked with for the last 30+ years. At the commission, he has had the opportunity to work with various natural resources ranging from waterfowl to wolves, but his greatest focus has been Monomin, or wild rice. So I'll let you take it away, Peter.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for everybody who's tuned in here this afternoon. I hope you brought a good lunch, and if you're lucky, you got a little wild rice in it. I'm going to try to do a very quick general overview, an introduction, sort of a little bit of background on the ecology and different ways you might try to steward this, what the Ojibwe would consider a more than human resource. And it'll be condensed, but we'll at least try to touch bases on quite a few things. And then we'll hand it off to Drew, who will take it from sort of this vague stuff that I'll talk about to how management or stewardship can really happen in the real world on the ground. So with that, I will try to do a screen share here, and hopefully everybody can see that now. Yeah, so Monomin and its stewardship. And this is, I'll just say, this has been a wonderful, wonderful resource, or a more than human being, depending on your worldview, to have the pleasure to work with in my career. I'm going to jump right into this and talk about what is Monomin. And it's worth clarifying right off the bat that in Wisconsin, I don't know where all of the listeners are today, but there's actually 2 species of plant that sort of get the common name of wild rice. There's southern wild rice, Zinnia aquatica, and this kind of old picture gives you an idea what this plant looks like. This is a very big, robust plant. It might be above your head when you're standing in a canoe. It's very important to wildlife. It's very worth stewarding, but it's restricted in Wisconsin now primarily to some of the big river systems in the southern part of the state, Wisconsin, Mississippi, and some other waterways. It's not a plant that actually grows in any real abundance in the ceded territories where I work. And that's, I work with perhaps a little better known of the two species, northern wild rice, Zinnia polustrus. And this is the plant that might grow 3 to 4 feet out of the water. And despite the plants being smaller, this actually has a larger seed. So from a human harvesting perspective, this is the one that accounts for almost all of the harvest in Wisconsin, not entirely, but probably in the upper 95 percentiles. I do like to point out always that Monomin is really, both of these species are North American resources, and particularly northern wild rice has this very limited global distribution. This circle doesn't quite capture it all, but it is the lion's share. And you can see that northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota contain almost all of the United States wild rice abundance, northern wild rice. And while we're the second cousin, I guess, to Minnesota in terms of abundance, Minnesota has probably 5 to 6 times as much rice as Wisconsin. This is still one of the few places in the world where we're able to steward this resource. And so it's really important, I think, that we do it here. In the same way that I hope people are taking care of redwood forests and salmon runs and things in other parts of the world, this is the one that we have the responsibility, I think, of being the global stewards for. I don't have time to get into it at any real detail, but I'm almost contractually obligated to talk about the cultural significance of wild rice to the tribes that I work for. And very, very briefly, it's really hard to overstate the significance of rice. The Ojibwe at one time lived along the eastern seaboard, and actually it was following prophecies that if they were going to survive as a people, they were going to have to move. And they underwent this long migration to this area here in the Western Great Lakes, following prophecies that indicated they'd be at their destination when they came to the place where the food grew on the water. And that food, of course, was Monomin or wild rice. Rice also pops up in important documents in tribal history. So like the treaties themselves, the land cessation treaties, wild rice, for example, is the only resource specifically mentioned by name in that treaty of 1837. Later, when the tribes petitioned to have lands for reservations, it was really important that they be adjacent to or include rice beds. And so some of the maps in Wisconsin today and the locations of the boundaries were really influenced heavily by the distribution of rice on the landscape. And that pictograph there shows the connection of the clans to the wild rice lakes. So all of these really critical cultural components, but also to other tribes. Menominee Indians actually take their name from this plant. And it also had a huge role, I think, to early Europeans in the whole development of the fur trade. This was the fuel that really fed the voyageurs and the fur trappers. And so, it's historically important in a broad way. Also can't really get into today, but this is tremendously ecologically valuable resource. And I assume I'm pretty much singing to the choir here and don't need this. Even in 20 minutes, I couldn't really cover all of the ecological benefits that rice provides, but anybody who's spent time in rice beds knows the diversity and the abundance of wildlife that they tend to support and all of the different traits that they add to the landscape. So these are rich and rewarding places to be in. I also like to point out that there's a lot of need to steward wild rice because so much has been lost. We have places like this, Rice Lake in Polk County, where that name is almost a vestigial organ because the rice is, for all practical purposes, gone. The other picture there, which showed the early development of the Chippewa flowage, that bed, the development of that flowage, it's got great ecological values now, but it also drowned out some of the biggest rice beds in the state at the time. And it was really interesting when they talked to tribal members about what would be lost if that flowage was built. The first thing they pointed to were the rice beds. But then they also talked about all of the other resources that were tied there, that was the place they went to fish. That was the place they did duck hunting. That was the place they did fur trapping. So all of these different resources are tied to Monomin. And I'll just mention, I love this older name of Manitugitigan, which is the Great Spirit's garden for rice beds. And it gives you an idea that the abundance, again, associated with these sites and how much we've been lost. And very much of that southern wild rice, actually, the losses have probably been even greater in Wisconsin than for the northern species. And rice faces a huge list of threats, and really, I think, a growing list of threats, and just a few quick examples of that here. But you can see, I think if you see my cursor, we have examples here of, this is an invasive, the narrowleaf cattail clones expanding into areas that previously had been occupied by wild rice. In the center, we have an image of a diseased plant. We're seeing more of this, I think, particularly with high humidities and warm temperatures that are probably associated with climate change. The black root mass at the upper right reflects a sulfide impact. Not a big issue in Wisconsin in most places, but it's been a very big one in Minnesota, where you have sulfide levels elevated as a result of mining activity. Of course, we have climate change going on, and almost every prediction of climate change brings negatives for wild rice. Just one example here, though, but you can see these big storm events that are coming more and more frequently, and the stress that puts on developing plants and on infrastructure. And this is a picture of one important rice bed that we lost following one of these 7-inch rainfall events that are becoming more and more frequent nowadays, obviously. And then I'm going to talk a little bit, too, about the impacts of geese and swans. That might not be as intuitive a threat to wild rice, but it's really an interesting change in the landscape, I think, that's taken place certainly over the course of my career. So quick ecological view here. Wild rice is an annual aquatic grass coming up every year, a new crop from seed. And the fact that it's an annual is probably the most important take-home point to remember. Its basic habitat preferences are really pretty well known. It grows in about 1/2 foot to 3 feet of water, with sort of the middle of that range probably being pretty optimal. Water should not be too acidic and not too darkly stained, although some moderate staining is all right. Generally prefers sort of a rich organic muck, the kind of thing you might, if you had a canoe paddle, you'd probably be able to stick it into that muck, oftentimes for several feet or more. But that's not always the case, and especially I think on some of the riverine sites, you'll find rice sometimes growing on sites that are actually pretty firm. This next point about water level fluctuations is probably the most important one. So in any given year, you probably don't like water fluctuations that are too wild or too random. But actually over the long run, you also don't want water levels to be too stable. And if you really hold in mind that this is an annual plant and it's almost weedy in nature that way, and it needs some regular disturbance to keep sort of its foothold on the landscape. And usually that disturbance is either high water years or low water years. And some of those are not going to be directly good years for the rice production themselves, but they will tend to knock back some of the perennial vegetation that rice competes with. And so keeping some natural variability in the landscape is really important. And so water level manipulation, where you have that, doing it intentionally can be really important, and not being too stable and not tilting that community towards perennials. You do need areas that are low in sulfates or sulfides, but again, unless you have something in your area that's responsible for sort of elevating those above background levels, that's probably not going to be a big concern. And the other habitat requirement, of course, with monomin is that it requires this gently flowing water. And so I'm lucky healthy rice beds have this pretty bright green characteristics that's pretty identifiable even from the air. And you see it growing along these rivers, especially in the meanders where the current slows and the nutrients settle out. You find it on lakes like this that have inlets and outlets. You won't find rice typically growing on these landlocked lakes. Now, if we kind of crunch some of the beauty out of this plant and reduce it down to a quick life cycle, monomin's got to pack a lot of living in a 6-month period. And it goes through several distinct growth phases. It germinates quite early in the spring, really very quickly after ice out. It has a submerged leaf period, and then it has this floating leaf stage, which I've circled here, really because that's oftentimes considered one of the most critical periods. The plant isn't fully developed. It's naturally buoyant, but their roots aren't well established at this time. And in these soft sediments, big storm events, high wakes, even from boats, it's quite easy to uproot the plant at that point. Curiously, once it reaches that level, it starts exchanging gases with the air. And if you resubmerge it, you can actually drown the plant out. And so that's another threat at that point. If you get through all of that, about the 4th of July, the plants start to become emergent. They may develop 1 or 2 stems, or they may have dozens of stems in some instances, especially when the plant density is low and the water is very shallow. The seed head develops. It's a spike with the male flowers being on separate bractlets somewhat below the female flowers where the seed heads form. Those flowers, if all goes well, it's a wind-pollinated plant. And if all goes well, those plants are starting to develop seed and mature around the end of August or early September, with riverine beds tending to mature earlier than lakes. But there's sort of a surprisingly wide variability on location on maturation. But of course, if you're a rice harvester, that's the time you're interested in being out in the beds. And I just added the picture of the seed in there too. Anyone who's familiar with the rice, it has this long awn on it that actually helps sort of bury the seed down into the sediment so that it's at a good depth for germination the next year. The rice is it's big. It's got a very limited natural dispersal ability. So flood events might carry it sort of downstream to other locations, but it's, it doesn't move well across watersheds and those kinds of things. That limited dispersal probably also has some real considerations as it faces climate threat impacts. Obviously, I'm going to have to step this up a little bit, but rice beds look very different at different times of the year because they're this annual plant, and again, moving through that cycle of early spring into the fall. But the other thing is that they look really different from year to year. Rice can vary a great deal. And the first rule of, I think that the elders taught me was that what they call the 4-year rule, and that in a 4-year period, you might expect one very good crop, like you see here at the top, 2 sort of average or midland crops, and then perhaps a failure. And this is a pretty natural part of wild rice in lake-like environments. The more riverine sites can be much more consistent in their year-to-year production, but this is something you kind of have to understand and accept as a rice manager on the landscape when you're working on lakes and flowages. Now, a few forms, there's a lot of different things you can do, and I'm going to just skip a stone over the top of these things, but some of the ways you might consider doing monomin stewardship, I would point out people have been doing this for a long time. This is my first year on the job, but actually this picture now is approaching 100 years old. And this is how long, or really much longer than that. The tribes were doing rice stewardship before Europeans got involved in it, but interesting old photo, it recognizes that the seed needs actually to be, you can't let it dry out, desiccate too much, or it'll lose its viability. And so they wrapped it in moss before transplanting the seed. And seeding is something that can really still be very effective today on the right sites. Some places that work really well are these artificial flowages, which tend to have the right habitat characteristics oftentimes. But again, the seed doesn't get there very readily on its own. And so you can see an example here was sort of the test seeding running through the center of this. And after several years of additional seeding and those plants rapidly starting to seed themselves, this became a really significant rice bed. Hydrology management is another huge thing that takes place. Probably the biggest loss of rice historically had to do with alteration of hydrology. This is just one example. This is Mud Lake in Burnett County, where this rice bed had kind of disappeared for about 20 years. We believed it was due actually to a culvert being raised about a foot when the township repaved the road, raised that water level just enough to really make it unsuitable for rice. What was interesting on this site was resetting that culvert to an appropriate site. We had a rather immediate response to the rice. This wasn't real thick, obviously, but this was a response in an area that had shown very little rice in 2 decades. And this occurred without seeding. It was just that water level correction. This lake, if people are familiar with this lake, there's a more complicated history in the last decade that goes on this, but we'll skip that for now. Infrastructure work, as I mentioned, can be an important thing, especially I think in the face of climate change. This is the Radigan Flowage, which was a tremendous jewel over rice bed in Douglas County, and blew out the dike on that site, and working to get this rebuilt, but it's really a challenge. As what seems to be the 100-year storms are now coming 4 or 5 years apart instead. And so making sure that things are up to this. And maybe we can get more sophisticated in some of our management. I know field staff are really stressed. They're spread thin. You've got a lot of properties to care for, but things like remote water level monitors that would give you some heads up and warning when these events are happening might be some ways to help address some of this. Another thing that can come into play is aquatic invasive control. There's a lot of invasives that we're concerned about, especially some of the submerged things like Eurasian water milfoil and curly-leaf pondweed. There's also a lot of important work to do to address invasives, but we want to make sure they're not having unintended impacts on the rice beds. And interesting that some of the successes that have been coming again with water level manipulation, overwinter drawdowns of 2 or 3 feet sometimes can have a big impact on knocking back some of these invasives and restoring this foothold for rice. And that might not be something you even have to do every year, but maybe on a periodic basis as you monitor the abundance of things. Beaver control can be an issue in some places. Beaver can also create rice habitat. So this certainly isn't an all-out war on beavers by any means. It's more of a selective strike. But where you have good rice beds and add beaver to them, you're likely to have some complications or problems. And this is just an example. This is one lake that was really successfully restored, but you could have thrown rice into it till your arm fell off, until we had the assistance of the APHIS staff getting in there and doing water level control and keeping the beavers off of the outlet of this site. We weren't really going to be successful. And I want to touch briefly on this swan and goose issue. They're beautiful things. They're certainly a natural part of the ecology up here. But it's really interesting how different things have become over the last 30 years. And if you're a young biologist, you might not realize that if you go back here maybe 30 years ago, there were almost no breeding geese or swans in the state. And this chart shows the Canada goose population in the northern part of the state. That sort of overlaps with northern wild rice range, how it has grown, similar trends as swans. And they can really hammer these beds. This might look like a healthy bed growing, but these plants should be a couple feet taller. Everyone is nipped off like this. And you can see an exposure here in the impacts there that take place. So this is something that has to be addressed in some places. And we're going to have to get more creative, I think, about it. Of course, education and outreach is important. Recruitment things are very important. We're really supportive of having more harvesters on the landscape and introducing people to this because they become good stewards of rice. Monitoring the abundance on the beds in your area is really important as well. And I think I'm probably gone as far as I should go, but just say, all of this is being done so that hopefully we continue to have pictures like this on the landscape 7 generations from now, that ricing and rice culture is still a part of Wisconsin. And with that, I will say thank you and stop sharing here and hand things off to Drew.
Thanks, Peter. That was a good overview.
All right, so our next speaker is Drew Hawley from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He's stationed at Crex Meadows in Burnett County, where he manages the large wetland complexes that make up the Glacial Lake Grantsburg Work Unit. The flowages on GLG produce much of the wild rice harvested in Northwest Wisconsin. So I'll let you take it away, Drew.
Okay, so Peter gave a really good large overview, and I'm going to focus very specifically on what's been done at the GLG or Crex Meadows, our 3 large wildlife areas in Burnett County. So, oh, my PowerPoint's not going. Oh, I'm having issues. Oh, there we go. So seeding, we've been working with GLIFWC from the beginning. I've only been working here for 7 years now, and but seeding actually started in the 1990s. That phantom flowage that Peter had a picture of was one of the first flowages that was seeded on Crex. And they acquired the seed just like I've been doing over the past few years, being in touch with tribal biologists. I've worked directly with Peter to acquire the seed, and planning kind of takes place this time of year. I usually let him know how much I'd like, and it really depends on the year of how much seed we can acquire. So it started on Crex in the 1990s, and it was at Crex Fish Lake Wildlife Area and Amsterdam Sloughs Wildlife Area. And I just looked through old files they had here and hand-drawn maps of where they started to seed flowages. And overall, there were 17 different flowages that were seeded. And since I've been here in the last 7 years, you can see remnant rice in all of those flowages, but there's truly only about 5 flowages that have abundant harvestable rice. This is a picture of one of them, North Fork. So this was back in the 1990s. This is Jim Hafler. He started doing it, and as you can see, there's a bag in front of him, and he's in a canoe. And here's another picture of Steve Hoffman that it shows the size bags that we get. And like Peter was saying in that historic photo where they were keeping the rice moist and rolled up in moss. What we'll do is we'll get the rice in seed bags like this and then store it in a pairing pond, or we'll get it and directly try to seed it out that day, not allowing it to dry out. There has been one instance where we got it fairly late and we did overwinter it in a pairing pond, but we had muskrats and they got into some of the bags, and it gets pretty dang rank and stinky if you wait to do it in the spring. So I would highly recommend doing it seeding in the fall as soon as you can acquire it. And the price has started to go up per pound of what it cost green. I think we are at about $3 a pound now. This is another picture just seeding it out from a canoe on a flowage. That's Steve Hoffman again, for those of you who know him. The things that the major elements that I've seen from the flowages that have abundant rice in large amounts, all those 5 flowages have very large water control structures, which even with the big storm events we've had over the last 5-6 years, we're able, the water level doesn't fluctuate too much with those storm events because we're actively pulling boards and trying to maintain, especially during that fragile growing period time. We're able to adjust and manipulate the water levels to keep it from rising too much during the floating leaf stage. This is another example of a structure that we replaced recently. This flowage, we're able to fluctuate this flowage by feet, like overnight. So when we have large rain events, we're able to keep the water level stable. So it takes a lot of constant monitoring, especially during that critical time period in June and July. This is phantom flowage, and you can see even with 3 large half moon risers, the beavers still had it plugged and we were having to go there every day. And I can't stress like the importance of, actively managing and being out there to make sure you don't have a beaver dam sit for, more than a day or two during that critical time period, because if that water level changes, 3-4 inches, it'll uproot the floating leaf rice. And it's I think Peter mentioned it in his slide. What I've found over the last 7 years, that we'll be flowing water all summer long, and like the 4th of July is always my target date to have the water flowing, remaining stable, or actually dropping, having the water level dropping up until that point. And then once we hit the 4th of July, I relax a little bit more and I'm not as concerned. It has been difficult. Last year wasn't as bad, but there have been some years in the last 5 where we've gotten those 4 to 6 inch rain events in July, and that's been detrimental on the rice, because not only rising water levels, but you get those high storm events and the wind and the wave action. It can be really hard when the rice is in this floating leaf stage. I've just kind of got a it's a time period looking out on phantom flowage from the same photo point, and it kind of shows you how open this flowage is. And the interesting thing about seeding rice on Crex and the other wildlife areas is we tried 17 different flowages, and there's a flowage within a half mile of this, same muck substrate bottom, same water quality type, and that was seeded, I think, 6 times, and it's never been able to establish rice. So it's sometimes a really frustrating plant to get established. So this is the growing season where it's critical to be flowing your water. This structure that I'm looking over the top of here, this is actually Bob Hansen's photos, was the one that was beaver plugged. So you're constantly going to it, making sure water is flowing. So right here, you can just see some floating leaf rice on the edges starting to appear. You can't see it out here, but out here, all on this flowage, you have rice in the floating leaf stage. Now you're starting to have some of it stand up, and you can definitely see it's more abundant. It's filling in all the open water area. So this is still a critical time that you want to have water flowing. And during this year, 2007, the water levels on this flowage were being dropped about a ½ inch a day. We were lowering them down to do some structure inspection. And what I've been told by previous managers here, and what I've learned just from experience, is that dropping water level is huge. And you can almost not, you almost need to be lowering the water level to a point of risking the fact if you go into a drought cycle, you won't be able to get back out there in a boat. You can have more dense rice on these flowages. So now at July 13th, we're past the floating leaf stage, everything's standing up. You don't have to worry as much. And in fact, if this wasn't a drawdown year in this flowage, this would be the time where I would put boards back in and start to maintain the water level or even rise it back up. But like I said, in this year, it was a drawdown. So the water continued to come down, and you can see how dense the rice is now out throughout the whole flowage. This phantom rice bed, Peter would probably know better than I. It historically was one of the largest producers of wild rice on Crex, and it's kind of become the second fiddle to North Fork flowage, which is located within a few miles. But one of the big factors out on Phantom, I think, is definitely the swans and geese are impacting it, along with some lily pad encroachment. So we're reaching mid-August, like this is about the peak of the drawdown. So now this year, I was not working here, but I know the rice was very prolific, but it was not able to be harvested because the water was not out there. And so water levels did come back up, but usually by September 14th, it's the end of the harvest season. Harvest typically is right around Labor Day. And there's anywhere from a 14-day to, it really depends on weather events and how hard the rice beds are hit. But later into September, you can see it turning more brown. We're getting closer to the beginning of duck hunting. And then by November, when it's frozen over, you can still see the remnants of the plants out there. I'm going to talk specifically about something I've been working on since 2016. This is a flowage to the east of Crex. It's actually on Amsterdam Slough Wildlife Area. Historically, it was a large producing wild rice bed that was harvestable. But since I had been here, it had not been. And there wasn't really a known reason why that had happened. So some of the strategies that I employed was I started holding the water levels a little bit lower. I looked through some of the historic records and tried to go back to what the water levels were at in the 90s, which was a little bit lower, but it makes the access a little bit more difficult to get in there, but it was a risk I was willing to take. And we've reseeded it now for 3 years, but the biggest factor I think that's contributed to the wild rice becoming more abundant is we've reduced the amount of lily pads that were in the flowage. This picture on the right in 2016, out in here, these are mostly all lily pads. It's not actually rice. And you can see here in this 2019, it reduced it quite a bit. And we did that through a winter drawdown. So these pictures are from August in 2018. I took these pictures in August. And I spoke with a wetland biologist in Minnesota who had dealt with water shield out competing wild rice in some of their flowages. And he had this great story about, they were looking at aerial photos, and there were these spider webs of clear open water throughout the flowage. And they had no idea why the water shield wasn't growing in these trails that were basically looked like a spider web. So they went out and they monitored it pretty heavily for a year, and they found that this flowage was also a panfish fishery. And there were a couple ice fishermen who were plowing trails to the spots they wanted to fish. So they were basically freezing down the flowage in those spots. And what that did, it froze out the root tubers, and it reduced the amount of water shield in those spiderweb areas. So what we did in 2018, we drew this flowage down in the fall. And when you do that, you want to have water levels stable by the beginning of October for basically for your herps and your turtles and whatnot. So winter drawdown, 2018, 2019. So this next picture is from, it's 1 year later. This was taken mid-August, and this picture is taken in 2019, a year later after the winter drawdown. And you can actually see the black giant root tubers of the lily pads that we were able to freeze out, and it reduced the amount of lily pads in that flowage by over 75%. So what we did then, what I also noticed then too, is I lowered the water levels even more in 2019 and 2020, and the rice just started to come back up that we had seeded in 2016 and 2017. We also got a new machine that's used for prescribed fire and all sorts of things, but it's a marsh runner. It actually floats, and it has become the way to seed rice, at least for us on our flowages. It's a lot easier than a canoe because you can haul a lot more rice. You can haul 400 pounds of rice in it and have somebody stand in the back and seed off of it. So this is a picture of a coworker. This is out in Blackbrook Flowage where this open water is. You can see this is all that's left of the lily pads that we're completely filling it out in here. So we reseeded all the remaining open water off the marsh runner. And it's for anybody who's seeded wild rice before, it's a lot better. It's a lot easier if you can stand up and have it right in front of you than be sitting in a canoe covered in it. It gets quite itchy. I think I have a short video here. We'll see if it'll play. So it's kind of like going to be our new way of feeding rice. All right, and this is kind of it's been the crown jewel since I've been here. This is a picture looking out at North Fork Flowage. That's all wild rice. In 2015, I think there was Peter can correct me on this, it was pushing 10,000 pounds of rice was harvested off of this flowage. So with that, anybody have any questions?
Yeah, so if you have any questions for Peter or Drew, thank you both for your presentations. Please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we are monitoring the chat box for questions. Drew Fowler has a question. I'm gonna stop your sharing, Drew.
Yep, I'm trying.
Yeah, we could always unmute people, or so Drew, I'll unmute you. This is Jennifer Summers speaking.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. I think it's the other Drew Fowler.
Yep. Are you able to unmute, Drew? Actually, here, let me find you here. All right. Give me just a moment.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Awesome. Hey, Drew and Peter, thanks so much for the presentation. This is really cool. My question was for both of you. I'm pretty ignorant to wild rice, but I think this is really fascinating to think about the role of hydrology in facilitating germination, and then also, I mean, your reseeding efforts. So I was gonna see if you could clear up for me a little bit. I mean, Peter talked about a natural cycle to this annual emergent plant being in lakes at some years, you begin to see succession or diminishing returns on your wild rice, right? The first year it's like really vibrant, second year, 50-50, and then that third year, that third photo, it's pretty open. And my question is that a product of the stabilized hydrology year after year, or is that a natural kind of succession of the plant? So what I'm trying to get at is the reseeding efforts more important than varying the hydrology? Because Drew, you showed examples of when you varied the hydrology, you had wild rice that responded to that without reseeding. So which one takes precedent in y'all's experience? I'm just curious.
Maybe I'll take a stab.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'd say I wouldn't describe it as succession. And it's not really even a cycle. It's more of an indication of natural variability on a lake bed. So even if you had a rice bed that's been there for 100 years and it doesn't need any seeding and it's just naturally maintaining itself, you're going to see that kind of variability. And I think some of the work behind that at least suggests that a part of it is driven by nutrient cycling. That actually when you have a really good crop one year, especially some of the nitrogen and things in the roots don't decompose fast enough to be available for the next season's crop. And so that's probably one of the things that's driving it. That's been shown more in sort of lab situation though than out in natural lakes, but I think that's going on. And then you lay over things like year-to-year changes in water levels and beaver impacts and all of those things. And it just sort of drives this variability. So it's a natural part on these lakes, goes back forever. And I just kind of pointed out because I do like to make people understand that if this is a resource you're managing for, you kind of have to have an expectation that it's not going to be there every year, especially on these lakes and flowages.
Yeah, it can be really frustrating too. We because I know all these flowages were seeded at one point. It was really interesting. Last year we drew a flowage down that I've never seen rice on, and then it was prolifically full of rice too, which was really interesting. But Peter, I also remember in 2015 when North Fork was so good, you told me, well, don't expect to see that again anytime soon.
But it'll surprise you too. I mean, it's, some places are surprisingly consistent, and the amount of flow through the system relative to its size will tend to make the beds more and more consistent.
All right, so we have another question from Scott. It says, what are your thoughts of the cultural experience associated with seating off the back of a marsh runner with a smiley face?
It's a lot easier. Yeah, I guess I was, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was doing it simply because it's not like an easy, we've done it out of the canoe before, which is probably more culturally significant, but it's not the easiest thing to do, and it's a little bit dangerous too when you're out there in the late October, November with 400 pounds of rice in a canoe. It was just a lot easier to do it that way. So I guess I wasn't necessarily maybe thinking about it in that regard. What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, I've only seeded from canoes, and some waters like Blackbrook, would be probably more challenging than others. But in a lot of places, it's not too bad taking canoe. We can throw 400 pounds in, and it might take some effort, but it's not actually too bad to do it that way either, depending on the site.
All right, and then we have a question from Marcy. Did you harvest by canoe or another method? Because there was a lot of rice there that was harvested.
So in both Wisconsin and Minnesota, which are the primary seed sources, canoe type harvesting is the only legal way to do it. But it's really variable. People who are harvesting for the table, for example, in Wisconsin, a typical ricing trip is about 30 pounds on average, but 100-pound day is not unheard of. And in Minnesota, sometimes 200 or 300 pound. I know Ricky Lean's on here from Minnesota. I've even heard of 400-pound days on rare occasions. So It is variable, but that's one of the reasons why. You can imagine if two people going out and spending a day ricing to get, 40 or 50 pounds in some cases, that's part of the reason why the price of seed, which is all coming from these kind of methods, is fairly expensive.
Speaking of Ricky Lean, he had a question too. Does USDA Wildlife Services still provide trapping services on wild rice lakes in Wisconsin, and how much does that cost?
They do. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. Maybe Drew, you remember how much?
Yeah, it varies. So if we have rice flowages, I usually work with our wetland ecologist and he'll take care of the contracts. But if we have rice flowages that we need to contract out, the last one we contracted, it was in the $600 to $800 range. It was basically trapping at one flowage.
And we have worked successfully with them for a long time. GLIFWC funds control on some select waters that the state does as well. The Forest Service funds some. So everybody kind of pays for a little bit what's in their backyard.
And here's a follow-up from Drew Fowler. How long are seeds viable in the seed bank?
A long time.
Out of the paddy wild rice industry, the domesticated wild rice, they suggest that after about 5 years, most of it is probably not viable, but there have been enough sort of anecdotal things, and I'll bet Drew's experiences there of these places. You do a drawdown, some places where there hasn't been rice in decades, and it pops up. So
yeah,
it might depend on what the conditions have been in the meantime, but.
Yeah, I mean, that flowage we drew down this last summer, I had not seen any wild rice in it in 7 years, and it was completely full. So it's at least 7. So I think it's kind of an unknown.
Okay, and then we have another follow-up from Scott. Peter, you touched upon the challenges that Canadian geese and swans may pose to the establishment of wild rice. I experienced the same in a small experiment. Any grand thoughts on what might be done to address the issue?
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for this. It really is. I consider climate change the biggest threat rice is facing right now, but I almost feel like swans and geese are the second. And especially small patches. Small patches are really hard to maintain. If you can get a large bed going, it seems like, and you get plants up into that emergent state, then the geese will work around the edges and things and don't hit them as hard. But when the beds are small, when they're sparse, and the geese can move through them, they can really effectively mow them down. And I think we're going to actually have to get into things like more lethal depredation control, especially while maybe doing restoration. If you get a bed well established, I think it can withstand that threat. But when you're starting off, it's a challenge. The second image I had there of that exclosure, that was sort of interesting. That came out of the St. Louis estuary, where they've been doing an awful lot of seeding and work to try to do restoration. And it hasn't been as successful as we'd like. And initially, I think a lot of people thought it was actually due to the fact that system is influenced by the record high levels of Lake Superior right now. But those exclosures, if nothing else, they're great learning tools to see what's impacting the rice on the landscape. And it's, that site, the state of Minnesota doesn't allow hunting in that area at this point. We're looking at either trying to open that up to hunting, which is going to probably have some more minimal impacts, but actually doing goose roundups and things might be necessary for a period of years to get it to take hold.
And then there's a follow-up on the goose swan question. Is it native swans or mute swans or both?
Native.
At Crex especially, right? That was the heart of swan restoration in Wisconsin. So there's a nice concentration there.
And then we have a question from Jeff Williams. Is there concern about hybrid wild rice spreading from Minnesota rice farms?
A little bit, yeah. So the Minnesota paddy industry, they have done certain things. They breed particularly for non-shattering. Wild rice matures gradually. They want a plant that tries to mature all at once, and that's the primary trait that they've bred for. They've done it more through traditional crossbreeding, but it is a wind-pollinated plant, and some of those beds are pretty close to natural stands, and so there's some concern about these altered genetics getting into wild beds. So far, it hasn't seemed to be a big issue, and it seems like when you take these domesticated strains, it's been domesticated for a relatively small period of time, they kind of seem to revert to a more wild strain fairly quickly. But it's a big issue, both culturally and environmentally. I think if you would talk about getting into things like genetic engineering, where you really insert some things that would never normally be found in rice, and having those things escape into the natural environment. And I think Minnesota right now actually has a moratorium on genetically engineered wild rice because of that.
And then we have, let's see, another one from Michael Arce from the Oneida Nation. He was wondering if the drawdowns have had any negative effects on the fish populations.
Well, so I can at least speak for Crex. There's no fisheries on Crex. They're all shallow flowages, and there's not enough dissolved oxygen in them. So the only fish we have are mud minnows, maybe some bullheads, but there's no fisheries within our flowages.
And I don't have a lot to add to that because a lot of these are really shallow spots. It may vary a little bit depending on the location, but I also know some sites where it was viewed as a positive for fish because there's a lot of decomposition that takes place on that rice straw, and that if you actually draw it down, you're taking that out of the water column, and that can reduce some of the oxygen demand over the winter.
And then this one is from Tanner Klein. The majority of the flowages in lakes that have been shown were of larger size. How successful can establishment be in smaller flowages, say less than 10 to 15 acres, that have control structures?
If you're able to manipulate the water and don't have issues with beavers, I would say, and you have the appropriate depth and muck bottom, I would guess you would be able to do it. But some of the smaller flowages on Crex, you kind of pick, and I guess there's so many that I guess I don't know if it was they weren't able to maintain the water level. I guess if you could have a large storm event on a 15-acre flowage and it not fluctuate the water level, I don't know. What do you think, Peter? I would say if you had the right conditions, you could do it.
Yeah, there's certainly places where beds of that size persist. Again, every site's kind of got its own unique characteristics. If you happen to have a whole bunch of resident geese there, that might be small enough to be a challenge. But if you can keep the geese off it and get it established, it might take hold and maintain itself. And I would say, all of this seeding work, the goal of that always is that it becomes a self-sustaining bed, and that seeding doesn't hopefully need to be sort of an ongoing activity. That's it's a restoration tool that hopefully you can move away from once you're in a good place.
And then John Simpson asks, could you speak briefly about the importance of water clarity, staining and turbidity to establishing wild rice?
It's a good question. Some clarity is important, especially early in the season, to have good germination take place and for that early plant growth. It's probably a little less important later in the year. One of the challenges rice has had at some places is carp, and we're not totally sure how much of that might be due to increases in turbidity that they cause versus physically uprooting plants versus actually consuming seeds out of the sediment. But turbidity is probably part of it. And where you do have high turbidity levels, that's, I think, another challenge. You might get by or deal with some of that by actually trying to operate down in, a foot to 18 inches of water instead of 2 to 3 feet of water. But it is a consideration.
And then Scott just had another comment on the goose issue. He said that the adults and goslings responded well to hazing with pyrotechnics in May and June, but then the muskrats took out all the rice stems in July when he wasn't looking.
It sounds like you're providing a lot of habitat.
All right, so with that, we've got it's about 5 to 1. I definitely want to thank both Drew and Peter for being our speakers this month. And I also want to remind people that we will be having this web series the second Wednesday of every month. And I'm continually looking for more topics and more speakers for this. And then also a reminder for the winter meeting that's occurring February 22nd through the 25th this month. I did post a link to that in the chat box. You can also Google the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society, and you'll find all the winter meeting information. It is only $30 to register. So, and also thank you to the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife for hosting this event, and the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society membership committee for putting this together. So thank you, everybody. And this will also be posted on the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society YouTube page as well.
Thank you. I'd also just mention GLIFWC has seeding guideline document we'd be happy to share with anybody who's interested. So, but thanks for the opportunity.